Given the skyrocketing rates of loneliness, depression, anxiety, and suicide since the release of the first iPhone in 2007 and Android phone a year later, we can say that our first attempt as human beings at creating healthy social relationships has largely failed. I'm Dr. Anthony Silard, your host of ReSocial. Are you the type of person who values nothing more in your life than your close relationships? If you are, ReSocial was created for you. We are often told a cynical story about human nature, that we are fundamentally selfish, and that the only way to get children, or anyone for that matter, to behave well is through a system of rewards and punishments. But what if that story is entirely wrong? What if all that energy spent trying to control behavior is actually the very thing preventing the genuine connection we crave with others? Hello, I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Silard, and welcome to ReSocial, where we rediscover, reflect on, and renew how we approach social interactions so we can develop CMSRs, compassionate, meaningful, sustainable relationships. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Alfie Kohn, a groundbreaking author who has spent decades challenging our deepest assumptions about human behavior. Today, we're going to discuss why our natural capacity for empathy is greater than we think, and how shifting from conditional to unconditional relationships can transform how we parent and connect with others. Dr. Alfie Kohn, welcome to ReSocial.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. As I've mentioned to you before, I'm a huge fan of yours, and it's really an honor that you're here.
Nice to hear that.
Yeah, so let's dive in, Alfie. So many of our listeners have grown up with the message that human beings are, at their core, selfish. Walk us through the findings of one of my favorite books, your book, The Brighter Side of Human Nature. What is the strongest evidence you found that altruism and empathy are actually just as innate as self-interest?
Well, there's a lot of evidence from cross-cultural anthropology. Sometimes we assume that just because a culture like ours, which is hyper-individualistic and competitive, must represent the human condition. Well, that's the kind of arrogance that comes from not realizing that not every culture is like ours. Not every age is like the current one. Things vary through history. But there's also evidence from social psychology and developmental psychology to indicate that while we certainly have the capacity to be competitive, we have the capacity to be cooperative as well, or neither of those. We have the capacity to be selfish, but also to be incredibly generous. And in fact, there's evidence that young children not only engage in a lot of what's called prosocial activity, which just means helping, sharing, caring, but that in many cases, they and we do it for reasons that are not just about getting something out of it, some sort of reciprocity. Often we do that and we do it deliberately, and that's not always a bad thing. But little kids sometimes become concerned about and stressed over the problems, the negative affect of other people, and they spontaneously try to resolve that, which means not only are humans capable of being helpful, but of being altruistic, which does not refer to some extraordinary Mother Teresa type event of self-sacrifice. It simply means helping just because the other person needs the help. So we have those capacities. We can be aggressive, horrifyingly so, but we can also be gentle and helpful. In other words, the core of human nature is to have a wide variety of possibilities in terms of how we act. So the question is, how are we going to raise our children? Which aspects of our society are we going to emphasize, rather than shrugging and saying, well, all the mean stuff must be at the core of who we are. It's just human nature.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lazy way of avoiding the responsibility of trying to promote what is better about ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think, Alfie, about that it may not just be that we have these two sides of ourselves. We have our sort of self-interested side and our other interested side, but actually the other interested side is stronger. Like research, for example, that's found that if you give participants you give them a $20 bill and you say, go buy something for yourself versus go buy something for someone else. And then you check later in the day, and those who actually gave something to someone else, the dopamine center of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, actually lights up more. It's like the feeling of accomplishment is and sort of achieving something is even greater when someone else benefits than ourselves. How do you explain that?
Well, I think I would exercise caution in extrapolating from that kind of finding. For one thing, the fact that dopamine may be released when you help is a kind of self reward from helping. So on
That's
some
right.
level, it's still bound to a self oriented response. And second, I think it also depends on the relationship of the other person to ourselves. It's not a uniform reaction, regardless
Mm.
of who those other people are. Do we know them? Do we like them? Are we similar to them? All of those things moderate the response we get. So I'm not somebody who believes that we are, in some sense, primarily, ultimately driven only to help others, or that
Hmm.
necessarily or inevitably takes precedence over attempts to benefit ourselves. I'm simply saying we have a window of possibility, and in many cases, to engage in cooperative activities in which, in a classroom or a workplace, we can arrange things so that none of us has succeeded until all of us have succeeded. So it is both in our interest and in others' interest to work that way. I like the possibility that it doesn't always have to benefit ourselves, that we have that kernel of altruistic possibility. But from a practical point of view, it's nice that we don't have to always choose between those two.
This is an excellent point you're making, that we tend to give more to others and act in more pro-social ways when we consider that other person is part of our group. It's part of our tribe versus someone who's from another group. And I know when you wrote The Brighter Side of Human Nature, this is certainly before AI and before a lot of the sort of hyper technology mediated communication that we're experiencing today, where people are on their phones, upwards of, I think the average is 2,500 times a day. People are touching their phones. The last time I checked, and now with all of the digitized communication, there's been research that's found that when we hear someone else's voice or see them, we're less likely to dehumanize them than when we read something that they write textually. So how can we take some of the really foundational findings of your research and apply them toward sort of in-person versus textual interactions with others?
Well, the obvious response, if your premise is correct, is that we should continue to be mindful of the need to see and deal with people in person. In a workplace, that means in person meetings, and especially one on one when possible, and don't always revert to the email or the pinging somebody on Slack and somebody, and realizing that in person friends are important. However, the plus side of digitized communication is that we're able to connect with far more people than humans have ever been able to do, even though in a shallower or less desirable way. And if we are able to do that with a diverse, heterogeneous group, that's powerful because that can challenge some of the stereotypical us versus them ways of understanding the world. There is research to show that we tend often to be tribal and to be
Yeah.
suspicious of people who we don't regard as one of us. However, there's also even newer research demonstrating that that isn't true when babies, for example, are raised with a variety of, say, folks from different races. They no longer prefer
Yeah.
to see the faces of those from their own race. The same thing is true for preschoolers, that in a more diverse group, you don't see the us versus them things that had been lazily attributed to just
Even
human
even
nature.
even later in life, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Kenya and also lived in Tanzania for about 4 years, and I remember when I first went, it was like I was very conscious of the racial differences, but
Right.
after about 6 months, they just kind of faded away, and I didn't see, "Oh, this person is African," or it was more like, "That's Mwakisha, that's Mwadime, that's Kenneth, Alfie, how can we appeal to the brighter side in others? How can we bring out that better side of others, the other oriented side, the pro-social kind? Like, how can we approach others in ways that produce cooperation rather than conflict?
Well, here we have to look not just at one-on-one interactions to try to change individuals' attitudes, but at the structural barriers to doing so. The respects in which, for example, in the United States, certainly our state religion is competition, with the false belief that competition
Mm.
motivates people to do their best, that competition builds character, that competition is just an inevitable part of human nature. In another book, I systematically attempted to debunk those assumptions. I've devoted most of my attempts to answer that question to look at little children, to get to kids while they're small, and to figure out the other structural barriers that take place in schools, to understand that awards assemblies or grading on a curve or other contests that are set up, including contests on the weekend that are called recreation, are ways that drive us in a direction that quickly becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, where we come to believe this is just the way we are, and then we continue to raise children in that way. So the way a parent or a teacher can begin to support and nourish the better sides of our nature begin by caring deeply about children, because the more we're cared about, the more that frees us up to listen to the cries of distress of others. It
This is
means imagining the perspective of children. How does this
Mhm.
look from their point of view, which in
well, let,
turn allows them to do perspective taking with others? When
well,
we
let's, Alfie, let me just interrupt for a second. We're gonna have a quick word from our sponsors, but let's come right back and let's focus on how we can take the brighter side of ourselves, as you mentioned, and apply to children, to parenting, and how we interact with our next generation. So don't go anywhere, listeners. Here with Dr. Alfie Kohn. We'll be right back.
Is there a protective shell around your heart holding you back from the connection you know is possible in your life? It's time to find your path to redemption. Introducing Love and Suffering by Dr. Anthony Silard. In Love and Suffering, which has received 4 book awards in psychology and mental health and 99% 5-star reviews on Amazon, Dr. Silard overturns what we've been told over a lifetime about love, forgiveness, acceptance, and gratitude. New York Times bestselling author Adam Alter calls Love and Suffering a compelling roadmap for a more connected and meaningful life. When you order Love and Suffering, 100% of the author's proceeds are donated to nonprofit education programs in Africa and Latin America. Invite more love into your life today. Love and Suffering by Anthony Silard is available now at Amazon.com and wherever books are sold. What if everything you've been taught about happiness and friendship is wrong? The artoflivingfree.org, the learning platform of the Center for Social Leadership, would like to offer you 2 free books by Dr. Anthony Silard: The Myth of Friendship, How Your Misunderstandings About Friendship Keep You Lonely, and The Myth of Happiness, How Your Definition of Happiness Creates Your Unhappiness. Get your free personal copies of The Myth of Friendship and The Myth of Happiness today. It's simple and easy. Go to theartoflivingfree.org/free happiness and friendship books and enter your email, then confirm the confirmation email in your inbox. You'll receive the links to download The Myth of Friendship and The Myth of Happiness. Enjoy your 2 free books by Dr. Anthony Silard today at theartoflivingfree.org/free happiness and friendship books.
Hello, I'm Dr. Anthony Silard. Welcome back to ReSocial. I'm here with Dr. Alfie Kohn, author of The Brighter Side of Human Nature, Unconditional Parenting, and many other books. This guy is really a genius and really one of my heroes. Alfie, again, thanks for being here with us. Let's now move into unconditional parenting. So you draw a sharp line between loving kids for what they do versus loving them for who they are. Many parents feel that praising good behavior and punishing bad behavior is just good parenting. What is the hidden relational cost of this conditional approach?
Well, punishments and rewards are ways of doing things to children rather than working with children to begin with. And considerable evidence indicates that whenever you punish, you lead children to ask, what do these people with more power than I have want me to do? And what happens to me if I don't do it? If we reward them or praise them, which is just like a verbal doggy biscuit, good job, that also is a way of doing things to children. And in that case, kids learn to ask the question, what do these people with more power than I have want me to do? And what do I get for doing it? So notice that the use of punishments and rewards offers a really good practical example of the very things we were talking about in the last segment about human nature itself. Anytime you give kids stickers or gold stars or desserts or a patronizing pat on the head for jumping through our hoops, or make them suffer because they didn't do what we wanted, which we euphemistically call a consequence, what we're doing, in effect, is making kids more self-interested so that they are thinking about only the question, how does this affect me? And they become less concerned with or attentive to the impact of their actions on other people.
I love what you're saying. It reminds me of the distinction between a human being and a human doing. It's like we love our children because not because of what they do, but because of who they are, just because they're being. And so this shift from doing to our children to working with our children, could you give our listeners? So let me tell you, a lot of our listeners out there, they're struggling with their kids, and especially one of the biggest challenges today that we hear a lot from our listeners in the feedback we receive is that the kids want to be on screens all the time. And so then they create these conditional structures, a lot of parents, where it's like, okay, well, if you go over your allotted screen time, which may be an hour a day or 2 hours a day or half an hour, depending on the age or the parent or the child, then if you go over, then there's going to be punishments. And how, like, could you perhaps offer a practical example of like what would this shift look like in a high stress moment, like a meltdown before school, or it doesn't have to be screen related. The child doesn't want to do their chores, they won't wash the dishes for whatever reason. The parent is not able to produce the behavior they want in the child, and so they resort to conditional strategies. How can you help them shift over to unconditional parenting?
I would start by pulling the camera back, so to speak, and looking earlier at the same time, rather than focusing only on a kid who doesn't do what we demand in the moment. A lot of parents say, give me another script then. Give me another trick to make the kid do what I have unilaterally decided he or she must do. There's the problem. So kids learn how to make good decisions by making decisions, not by following directions. And so my first question, if a parent comes to me and says, you know, my kid is spending longer on the screen time than I have determined for no good reason necessarily is the appropriate cutoff, or the kid isn't doing the chores that I have demanded the kid do, the problem here isn't that the kid isn't obeying us. The problem is with an obedience-focused approach to parenting, where we need to do a lot less telling and a lot more asking. Now, obviously, this depends on the item that we're talking about. Are we talking about an activity where doing something is literally a risk to safety, or it just violates my personal preference or affects my convenience? Are we talking about a 3-year-old or a 13-year-old? There's going to be a lot of variables here. But even very young children can be brought into the process of deciding what is reasonable and why. If I'm a kid and I've been told you have only an hour a day of screen time, that is entirely arbitrary. And the main message I get from that is not that screen time can be overdone. My main takeaway from that is this dictator in my house doesn't have to give or have reasons. The more the focus is on, here's the reward you get for doing what you're told, or here's the punishment you get for not doing it, the more I learn that life is about following orders of people with more power. And I will take that with me and either become slavishly compliant, including later to governmental and corporate figures, or a knee jerk rebel rather than a thoughtful rebel who just, if you say up, I say down. Neither of them is about creating responsive and responsible people. So I give in my book, Unconditional Parenting, examples of how I use one with my own daughter, who was very slow in getting ready in the morning when she was in preschool, and how I brought her into the process of thinking about possible solutions and reasons for why it makes sense for us to try to be a little more efficient in the morning. And this doesn't always work, but what it's doing is not only more likely to elicit a response that's going to be effective because the kid played a role in creating that solution, it is also communicating trust in and respect for the child, which is the opposite of the bribe and threat approach to parenting.
So are you suggesting, Alfie, then, okay, I am a parent with two children who like to be on screens a lot more than I'd like them to be. Are you
Mhm.
suggesting that instead of telling them you have an hour and a half a day, that it would be a better approach to sit down with them and say, look, as you guys know, there's a lot of research that screens are leading to a lot of depression, anxiety, loneliness, especially in children and teenagers. You know, I don't want you to be on screens too. I don't want you to overdo it, but I know you also don't want to overdo it. How can we come to a solution together, or what sort of collaborative
Yeah,
interaction model
right.
would
Some
help me to?
variation of that, which ends with a question. Although I wouldn't speed too quickly past the, as you know, research suggests,
Hmm.
because I think it's important to know what the research says ourselves, but also in a way that's fitted to the child's developmental capacity to understand, to make these arguments very real, and to help the child become more attentive to their own experience of how they sometimes feel after spending a long time on a screen, and the way people tend to get numbed out and a little bit depressed, and see whether that's true, especially when they've done it for a long time versus a short time. I would also emphasize that, and by the way, this is one of the through lines in all my work on this, is don't just look at behavior. The more you look at it, the behavior that can be seen and measured, the more you're losing out on the complexity of the situation, on the motives and
Hmm.
reasons and values of the child that inform the behavior. And there's a lot of difference between, I wouldn't just say all screen time should be treated the same. And in fact, research suggests that the more negative effects come from the mindless passive scrolling than
Exactly.
from actively writing and creating things on screens. I would
Hmm.
not treat those as interchangeable. And I would invite a child to reflect on the differences between those and maybe to say, how can we limit the kind that makes us feel sort of crappy and even like I need to do more of this? I would also introduce children, again, depending on their age, to the respects in which big tech is deliberately attempting to make us addicted to this for reasons that have to do with their profit as corporations, not our well being as users. Even a 7 or 8-year-old can understand that limiting our screen time is an act of appropriate collective rebellion against folks who do not have our best interest in mind, which is an interesting reframing from daddy says you have to stop after an hour or else.
For our listeners out here, I think you can see now why Alfie is one of my heroes. And really, you go way beneath the surface. And I just want to thank you for the contribution you've made and you're making to humanity. Even here, you just brought up something that's really giving me pause to think differently. Because right now, you and I are using screens to actively create something that's beautiful and can help others. And why am I then going to my children and just saying, there's just this monolithic screen time without really differentiating how they're using their screens? That's an excellent point. So, Alfie, please tell us where can our listeners learn more about the good work you're doing to help us improve our relationships with our children and with each other?
My website has everything and more that people could ever want to know about me. That's just my name, alfiekohn.org, which has information about my books, and it has hundreds of articles and blog posts for free, and my own podcast, which I started last year, which is mostly about education, called Kohn Zone, and as of now has a couple of dozen episodes on a variety of topics.
Wonderful. So you hear that, all of you out there. Go to Alfie Kohn, ALFIEKOHN, alfiekohn.org. I'll also put that in the show notes for you. So, Alfie, I have to say, my day is much better because of the connection we've further developed here. I really want to thank you for joining. I think you've made a really core point to the compassionate, meaningful, sustainable relationships we're really promoting in this show, that the core mechanism of a CMSR, or a compassionate, meaningful, sustainable relationship, is unconditional love and support. And when parents use conditional strategies, children learn to focus on managing how they're perceived rather than developing authentic compassion. Shifting to unconditional support, as you so well put it, builds the foundation for deep, sustainable relationships. Alfie Kohn, thank you so much for joining us here today at ReSocial.
My pleasure. Thanks for your interest.
Hello, I'm Dr. Anthony Silard, and thank you for tuning in to ReSocial. I'd like to ask you a question and a favor. First of all, the question: would you like to leave us feedback about what you've enjoyed about ReSocial and what you think can be improved? Please send your feedback to ReSocial at theartoflivingfree.org. Once again, ReSocial at theartoflivingfree.org. Also, feel free to send us what you'd like us to address in ReSocial, challenges you're experiencing in your life related to how you develop compassionate, meaningful, sustainable relationships with others. And finally, a favor: please subscribe to ReSocial or like ReSocial on whichever way you're tuning into it. Thank you so much. Let's end the way we always do. Until we meet again, please remember that between you and the CMSRs, the compassionate, meaningful, sustainable relationships you desire in your life, lies an invisible social barrier you construct in your mind. It's entirely up to you to push through this barrier and watch it disappear into the mist. Be the change you desire and reach out to another person. Then use the tools you learn, refine, and align with your own values in ReSocial to develop a CMSR. Be kind, be generous, and be caring. I'm Dr. Anthony Silard. Thank you for joining us on ReSocial. I'm looking forward to being together with you again next week in the world filled with CMSRs we are creating together.